I'm Bethany Marsh, and I took a DNA test that claimed I am half Bigfoot. I froze when I read the results, and after months of further research, I have to face the horrifying truth. What these tests say about my DNA has made experts deeply uncomfortable because I might be more Sasquatch than human. It started with unusual blood work at a routine physical. My doctor suggested a DNA kit since I was adopted with zero medical history on my biological side. So I ordered one, swabbed my cheek, mailed it off, and forgot about it completely. What came back was a phone call from a geneticist who sounded genuinely nervous, results that a university lab independently confirmed, and 3 separate scientists using the exact same phrase. We have never encountered anything like this before. My doctor wanted to know if I had a family history of heart disease. Turns out my family history is a little more complicated than that. The last normal day I remember was a Tuesday. I was grading spelling tests when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. My doctor flagged unusual blood work at my annual physical, nothing alarming, but unexplained. Since I was adopted with zero medical history on my biological side, she suggested a consumer DNA kit to surface any hereditary flags. A coworker who had spent 4 months telling everyone she was 17% Scandinavian finally convinced me to actually order one. I swabbed my cheek, mailed it, and forgot about it completely for 6 weeks. When the results came back, I scrolled through the usual sections, ancestry breakdowns, genetic traits, caffeine metabolism, until I hit something near the bottom with different formatting and a small red flag icon. The header read, "Sequence anomaly detected. Additional review required." The paragraph underneath was written for a scientist. The only phrase I absorbed clearly was, "Unclassified hominid sequence, origin undetermined." I told myself it was a glitch, closed the app, and went back to teaching. That night, I opened it again 4 times. It said the same thing every time. 2 days later, a geneticist from the company's research division called me. Not customer support, research. She said my sample had flagged something unprecedented, a sequence matching no known human population, no ancient human relative, no known primate on record. They had run it 3 times before calling. She asked for a second sample, then a hair sample, then a blood draw at a partnered clinic. Each request felt like another step down a staircase with no visible bottom. All 3 confirmed the same result. While the lab went quiet, I researched on my own and fell into something I wasn't prepared for. Ghost lineages, ancient human relatives living only in DNA with no fossil record, and eventually a fringe paper arguing that if something large and unclassified had ever interbred with humans in the northern Rockies, it would look exactly like what was sitting in my results. I closed the laptop, lay in the dark, and thought about the fact that I'd been hiking alone in the Beartooth Range every weekend for 6 years. That thought felt different at midnight than it ever had before. 6 weeks after the blood draw, the geneticist called again. Same careful tone, same deliberate pauses, but something underneath it this time that hadn't been there before. She said the extended analysis was complete and that they wanted to walk me through the findings in a video call with 2 additional members of their research team present. I agreed and spent the next 4 days not sleeping particularly well. The call was professional and controlled right up until it wasn't. They confirmed everything the previous tests had shown and then went further. The unclassified sequence constituted approximately 47 to 52% of my total DNA, which they explained ruled out any possibility of this being a distant ancestral trace. A 1 or 2% figure might suggest ancient interbreeding several thousand years back. 50% meant one of my biological parents carried this sequence as a dominant part of their own genome. Whatever this was hadn't happened thousands of years ago in some distant lineage. It had happened 1 generation back. Then, one of the researchers used a phrase that I wrote down verbatim on the notepad I'd had sitting next to me since the call started. He said the sequence showed markers consistent with a hominid of probable North American origin, unclassified, not currently represented in any global database. North American origin. I underlined it twice and didn't fully understand why yet. I called my sister that same night. She's my adoptive sister. We grew up together, and she is the only person I trusted with this before it became what it became. I told her everything from the blood work to the video call, and she listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then she asked one question. She asked which parent. I hadn't thought about it in those terms yet, and the question stopped me completely. 50% meant 1 biological parent. 1 biological parent who carried something no database on Earth could identify. I was adopted with no information on either side. No names, no records, nothing. Which meant somewhere out there was a biological parent I had never found, never looked for, who was apparently not entirely human. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours, and neither of us had anything useful to say. The following week, I requested my original adoption records from the county. The file that came back was thinner than I expected. A single folder, a few pages. I was left at a fire station when I was 3 days old. No note, no name, no information on either biological parent. The caseworker who handled my placement had retired years ago, and the trail ended there completely. But there was one detail in the file I kept coming back to. The fire station where I was left was in a small county in northwestern Montana, deep in a region that borders one of the largest stretches of uninterrupted national forest in the entire state. Hundreds of thousands of acres, some of the most remote wilderness in the continental United States. I pulled it up on a map and sat looking at it for a long time. I don't fully know why I posted about it. It was late, I was exhausted, and I think I had been carrying it alone for long enough that I just needed to put it somewhere outside of myself. I didn't frame it dramatically. I wrote maybe 4 sentences explaining that I'd taken a DNA test for medical reasons and received results that 3 separate scientists had described as something they had never encountered before, and that the leading explanation being floated internally was a hominid sequence of North American origin with no database match anywhere in the world. I posted it at 11 p.m. and went to bed. By 6 the next morning, I had 3,000 notifications and a missed call from a journalist. Within 48 hours, the post had been shared hundreds of thousands of times, and the comments had split into 3 distinct camps, so cleanly it was almost methodical. The first group thought it was hilarious, a new form of internet absurdity to be screenshot and passed around. The second group was convinced I was lying, that I had fabricated the entire thing for attention or a future sponsorship deal, or some other motive they were very confident about despite knowing nothing about me. The third group was the one that surprised me. They were not laughing, and they were not skeptical. They were deadly serious, and they had questions, very specific questions, the kind that suggested they had been waiting for something like this for a long time. I went to work that Monday morning and sat in front of 21 8-year-olds who had no idea their teacher was trending. The third group found my contact information faster than I would have thought possible. By the end of the first week, my inbox contained messages from researchers, field investigators, documentary filmmakers, and a significant number of people who described themselves simply as having been in the forests of the Pacific Northwest for decades, looking for something they had never been able to prove. 2 large organizations I had never heard of both contacted me within hours of each other, each claiming my case fell under their area of research, and each strongly suggesting I should work exclusively with them. They appeared to dislike each other enormously. There was already an internal argument happening in comment sections I hadn't visited about whether my results were genuine or a deliberate attempt to undermine what one person described as 40 years of legitimate fieldwork. I did not respond to any of them. I turned my notifications off and called my doctor to tell her this was not what she had in mind when she suggested the kit. Mainstream science was faster and louder in its dismissal. A geneticist at a large state university gave a quote to a national publication calling my results almost certainly a novel mutation being misclassified by an algorithm not sophisticated enough to categorize it correctly. A primatologist said the entire premise was biologically impossible and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, which this was not. The coverage was largely mocking in tone, and I understood why. I probably would have written the same thing a year ago. But one researcher, a paleoanthropologist at a university I respected, told a reporter off the record that ghost lineages were real, that North America was arguably the least genomically explored region on Earth in terms of ancient populations, and that she personally would not dismiss anything without seeing the raw data first. That quote ran in one small publication and was largely ignored. I saved it. 3 weeks after the post went viral, a genetics lab at a major university contacted me directly, not through social media, but through a formal written letter mailed to my home address, which I still don't entirely know how they obtained. They offered to run a full independent analysis of my DNA at no cost to me. Whole genome sequencing, comparison against every hominid database currently in existence globally, full peer review process. No media involvement, no public statements until the science was complete. Just the work. I said yes for the same reason I'd said yes to everything else, because not knowing felt worse than knowing. They estimated 3 months. I signed the consent forms, drove to a clinic they partnered with, gave more blood, and started the longest wait of my life. Those 3 months were the strangest of my life and also in many ways the most mundane. I still went to work every day. I still walked my dogs every morning and every evening. I still hiked on weekends, still ordered takeout 4 nights a week, still lay awake some nights staring at the ceiling. The world had decided I was either a curiosity or a fraud, and either way, it had largely moved on to the next thing by week 3, which was a relief. But the offers kept coming quietly in the background. A documentary crew, a podcast network, a Bigfoot tourism company in Washington State that wanted me as a brand ambassador, which was the one that made me laugh out loud for the first time in months. A tabloid ran a story claiming they had located my biological father, a man in Oregon. The DNA didn't match. They had fabricated it entirely. I taught my class, walked my dogs, and waited. The university called on a Thursday morning while I was on my lunch break. The researcher I had been corresponding with asked if I was somewhere private, and I walked to my car in the parking lot and sat there with the engine off. She said the results were complete and verified across every database they had access to globally. The sequence was real, consistent, and constituted just under 50% of my total genome. It did not match Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, Denisovan, or any other classified hominid in any database anywhere in the world. She said their team had spent considerable time debating the appropriate language for their findings and had settled on a designation I wrote down word for word. Unclassified late Pleistocene hominid, probable North American origin, no existing fossil or genomic record. She asked if I had any questions. I looked out through my windshield at the school parking lot, at the handicapped space and the speed bump, and the crossing guard finishing her lunch at the picnic table by the entrance, and I told her I didn't know where to begin. The phrase North American origin sounds simple until you actually sit with what it means. Every ancient human relative ever identified, every ghost lineage, every unclassified population that has ever shown up in genomic data has originated in Africa, Asia, or Europe. The entire known story of human evolution plays out in the Old World. North America has no classified ancient hominid species, no fossils, no artifacts, no genomic signatures in any existing database suggesting anything human-like was here before the ancestors of modern indigenous populations arrived. The established science is unambiguous on this. What the university lab was saying was that something lived here that we have never found. No bones, no tools, no burial sites, nothing. Just a sequence running through 50% of my DNA, pointing at a population that existed on this continent and left no physical trace except whatever biological thread eventually made its way to a fire station in northwestern Montana and then to a classroom in Billings 34 years later. The question my sister had asked me the night of the first call kept coming back after the university results. Which parent? The math was straightforward in a way that made it worse. 50% meant one biological parent carried this as a dominant part of their own genome. For me to present as fully human in appearance and function, the other biological parent almost certainly had to be entirely human, which meant the non-human sequence came from one side only, cleanly, one parent who was either partially or significantly something that no laboratory in the world could classify. I had been left at a fire station 3 days after I was born. Someone made that decision. Someone drove to that fire station in the middle of northwestern Montana and left a 3-day-old infant and walked away. I had spent 34 years not thinking too hard about who that person was. I couldn't afford not to think about it anymore. A genetic genealogist reached out to me about 6 weeks after the university results became public. Not a hobbyist, a professional, someone who worked cold cases and missing persons through DNA matching. She had followed my case and offered to help me trace the human portion of my genome through existing ancestry databases, since the unclassified sequence couldn't be matched to any family tree, but the human 50% potentially could. I agreed, and we worked together for several weeks. The unclassified side was a dead end, as expected. Nothing in any database came close, but the human side eventually surfaced a match. A third cousin estimate, the genealogist said, which meant a shared great-great-grandparent somewhere. The match was a woman living in Idaho who had no idea who I was and had never heard my name. I emailed her. She wrote back the same day. The Idaho woman was warm and generous with her family history, walking me through her maternal grandmother's side with the detail of someone who had always been the keeper paper of family stories. Most of it didn't connect to anything until she mentioned offhandedly that her grandmother had a younger sister who disappeared in 1953. She paused in the way people pause around the parts of a story that never got resolved. The sister's name was Alara, 22 years old, living in a small logging community in the northern Idaho panhandle. One day she walked into the forest and didn't come back. No body found. Investigation closed. Family assumed she died out there, but her grandmother never believed that, not based on any evidence, just a feeling she carried her whole life and mentioned only once near the end of it to her daughter, who mentioned it to hers, who was now telling me. The feeling was that Alara hadn't been lost, that she had stayed. I looked the logging community up after we hung up, remote even by the standards of that region, sitting at the edge of a vast stretch of forest in the Idaho panhandle, approximately 200 miles from the fire station in northwestern Montana, where I had been left as an infant 34 years ago. In a wilderness that size, 200 miles is nothing at all. Alara is not my biological mother. I want to be clear about that because the timeline doesn't allow it. She disappeared in 1953 and I was born decades later. But she matters to this story in a way I'm still working out completely. The Idaho woman represented my human side. Her grandmother and Alara were sisters, which means Alara's bloodline runs parallel to the human 50% of my DNA. Alara didn't disappear from the other side of the country or the other side of the world. She disappeared from the edge of the same vast wilderness system that eventually produced me. A young woman who walked into those forests in 1953 and, according to her sister's lifelong instinct, didn't die there but stayed there. And decades later, an infant appeared at a fire station on the other side of that same wilderness with DNA that no laboratory on Earth could fully classify. I'm not drawing a straight line. I want to be careful about that, but I keep coming back to the shape of it, the geography, the timeline, the word stayed, and I can't make it feel like coincidence no matter how hard I try. Something connected these dots long before I started looking for them. Whatever happened in those forests, it didn't start with me. I think it started with a 22-year-old woman who made a choice that her family spent 70 years calling a disappearance because they didn't have another word for it. I'm not sure I have a better word either, but I'm looking. People kept asking me what I thought it meant, and for a long time I didn't answer because I genuinely wasn't sure I had the right to an opinion on my own biology before the science had finished speaking. But the science has said what it's going to say, and I've sat with all of it long enough now to tell you where I actually land. I don't think my biological father was what you picture when you hear the word. I don't think he was something monstrous or unknowable or incomprehensible. I think he was a person, or close enough to a person that the distinction might not mean what we assume it means, who belonged to a lineage that had been living in those forests for longer than anyone has been looking, not hiding exactly, just existing separately, the way isolated populations do, in a place large enough and remote enough that separation wasn't difficult to maintain. I think about Alara walking into those forests in 1953 and staying. I think about whatever she found there, or whoever found her. I think about a child left at a fire station 3 days old with no note and no name. And I think that someone made that decision carefully, that it wasn't abandonment in the way I spent years quietly understanding it, to be but something more like a choice made at the edge of two worlds by someone who understood that I belonged more to one than the other. I've always felt like I didn't quite fit. I thought that was just what being adopted felt like. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe it was always just the truth of what I am trying to find the surface. While the scientific paper moves through peer review, something else has started happening quietly in the background that I don't think gets enough attention. A bioethicist at a university I won't name reached out to my lawyer several months ago with a question that I hadn't thought to ask myself. If a portion of my DNA belongs to an unclassified non-human species, what am I legally? It sounds abstract until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. My genetic data has been analyzed by 2 separate laboratories, shared with research teams, referenced in a paper currently under peer review, and discussed in media coverage reaching millions of people. At no point did any existing legal framework pause to consider whether the standard protections applied to a person whose biology doesn't fit neatly into the human category those protections were written for. There are no laws that account for this. Nobody wrote them because nobody thought they needed to. And if I exist in this gap, the question that follows immediately is whether others do too. Whether there are people living in those forests right now with no legal identity, no protected status, no recognition of any kind, that question keeps me up at night more than any of the others. I turned down everything for a long time. Every documentary, every podcast, every interview request, every offer that arrived in my inbox, which by month 4 was still receiving several a day. I turned them down because I didn't trust that any of them wanted the actual story more than they wanted the version of the story that was easiest to sell. Eventually, one filmmaker reached out differently. No pitch, no treatment, no talk of distribution deals. Just a letter, handwritten, explaining why she thought this story deserved to be told carefully, and asking if I would be willing to meet for coffee with no obligation attached. I met her. We talked for 3 hours. I said yes. The documentary is still being made. I have approval over nothing except my own words, which was the only condition I set. I don't know what it will look like when it's finished. I know that I'm still a 3rd grade teacher from Billings, and that whatever it becomes, that part stays true. My life looks strange from the outside right now, and completely normal from the inside, which is a disorienting combination. I still teach, I still hike on weekends, still in the Beartooth Range, still mostly solo. My dogs still destroy the yard on a daily basis, and the kitchen faucet is still leaking because some things are apparently immune to life-changing events. The research teams are in the field now. 3 separate groups operating independently in the Montana and Idaho wilderness specifically because of my case, looking for biological evidence of something that has never been formally acknowledged. I don't know what they'll find. I check my email less than I used to because the volume of it stopped feeling manageable around month 2 and never recovered. My sister calls every Sunday. My doctor, the one who started all of this with a pamphlet and a smiling family on the front, told me at my last appointment that my blood work still shows the same unexplained markers it always has. Of course it does. We know why now. We just don't have a box to put it in yet. I want you to think about what it would mean if this is exactly what it appears to be. It would mean there is a species, or the remnant of one, living in the forests of the American Northwest that has never been formally documented, never been protected, never been acknowledged by any government or institution with the power to do something about it. Their habitat has no special status. Their existence has no legal recognition. They have been out there, if they have been out there, without a single law written with them in mind. And people have known, not governments necessarily, not institutions, families in remote communities who kept certain things local the way rural communities always have, who had a word for what lived at the edge of the tree line that never made it into any official record. Ilara's family called her disappearance a disappearance because they didn't have another word that the rest of the world would accept. That silence wasn't conspiracy. It was just the distance between what people know and what they can prove. If the peer review publishes and the science holds, that distance closes. And everything that comes after that, the legal questions, the conservation questions, the human rights questions, arrives all at once with no framework in place to handle any of it. We are not prepared for what confirming this would mean. I'm not sure we can be. I know what you've been waiting for this entire time, and I've been careful not to say it directly because I wanted you to arrive here the same way I did, slowly, through the evidence, without the word getting in the way of the actual story. The university paper is currently under peer review. The designation they have assigned to the sequence in my DNA is unclassified late Pleistocene hominid of probable North American origin. That is the official scientific language, and I have enormous respect for the carefulness of it. But there is a word that has existed in this country for over a century, a word that indigenous communities across the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies have used for far longer than that. A word that has been laughed at and dismissed and turned into a costume and a punchline and a tourism logo for so long that saying it seriously feels almost impossible. The scientists won't say it. The peer review won't say it. The documentary probably won't lead with it. But half of my DNA comes from something that lived in the forests of the American Northwest and left no fossil record and no trace of its existence except a sequence that no laboratory on Earth can match to anything in any database anywhere in the world. I was left at a fire station in northwestern Montana 3 days after I was born. I am a 34-year-old school teacher from Billings, and according to every test, every researcher, and every piece of evidence currently available, my father was a Bigfoot.